Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. So we are unpacking a really comprehensive, deeply fascinating review from the Open Volume. They took a long, hard look at an absolute cultural phenomenon, Jonathan Cahn's explosive 2012 bestseller, The Harbinger. This book caused a massive stir when it hit the shelves, and the Open Volume provides a super rigorous theological critique of its claims. Let's jump right in.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this exact disclaimer, pulled right from the book's preface. It perfectly sets up the mystery box that the Harbinger relies on. Cahn tells the reader up front that he's blurring the line between fiction and fact. He presents his book as an imagined story, yet simultaneously claims the spiritual and prophetic realities inside it are completely 100% factual. As the review points out, this genre-bending approach is exactly what made the book so incredibly compelling to millions, but it's also exactly where the critical problems begin.
Okay, so here's the structured path we're taking through the review's analysis today. We'll look at the best-selling prophetic mystery, then decoding the 9 harbingers, move into exegesis versus eisegesis, weigh the strengths and deep weaknesses, and finally arrive at the final verdict.
Starting off with Part 1, the best-selling prophetic mystery.
To really grasp this, we have to understand the sheer scale of what we're looking at. Jonathan Cahn, a Messianic Jewish rabbi with no formal academic theological credentials, wrote this as his debut book. And guys, it didn't just sell well. It spent over 100 consecutive weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It really struck a profound chord with readers trying to make sense of America's cultural shifts and tragedies. The core thesis of the book relies on a single Bible verse, Isaiah 9:10. Which was an oracle of judgment pronounced against ancient Israel after an Assyrian invasion way back in 732 BC. Israel's response to that attack was arrogant. They defiantly vowed to rebuild stronger. Well, Cahn argues that this isn't just ancient history. He claims it's an active pattern of divine warning and judgment operating right now in modern America, specifically comparing the Assyrian invasion of Israel to the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001.
Let's move to Part 2, decoding the 9 harbingers. Okay, let's dive into this. The book constructs its prophecy blueprint through a highly readable fictional narrative. It follows a journalist who meets a mysterious prophet, and this prophet hands him ancient clay seals one by one, with each seal revealing a new sign. The review outlines how this reveals 9 specific physical and verbal signs that Cahn claims map directly onto America. It starts with the breach of 9/11 and the terrorists of Al-Qaeda acting as the Assyrians. Then we see the physical parallels, the fallen bricks of the World Trade Center ruins, the tower representing the vow to rebuild, a 20-ton Gazit stone lowered to ground zero. Then we have the trees, a fallen sycamore and a planted Erez tree. Finally, the utterance and the prophecy. This is where Cahn points to speeches by American politicians like John Edwards and Tom Daschle, who actually quoted Isaiah 9:10 to call for national resolve. According to Cahn, they were completely unaware they were actually sealing a prophetic judgment.
Then, the book extends these harbingers right into the economic realm, bringing in the concept of the Shemitah. The reviewer notes Cahn's argument that the September 2001 market crash and the September 2008 global financial collapse occurred exactly 7 years apart. And get this, they both fell on the exact same Hebrew calendar date, the 29th of El, which is the biblical day for wiping away debt. Cahn uses this to argue that this kind of numerical precision absolutely proves divine orchestration.
Which brings us to Part 3, exegesis versus eisegesis.
Now, this next concept is the absolute core of the Open Volume's critique. It's not about debating if 9/11 was tragic or if America is in decline. It is a methodological critique about how Cahn actually reads and interprets the biblical text to arrive at his massive claims. To get this, we have to look at the grammatical historical method. This is the crucial academic standard used by theologians. Basically, you interpret a text based on what the original author intended to say to their original audience in their specific historical context. So, using this method, scholars universally recognize Isaiah 9:10 solely as a specific historical indictment of 8th century Israel. There is no hidden code meant for a nation thousands of years in the future.
Contrast that with eisegesis. This happens when an interpreter introduces their own ideas, presuppositions, or agendas into the reading of a text. Instead of drawing the meaning naturally out of the text, which is exegesis, you read your own meaning into it. and this brilliantly illustrates the reviewer's main argument. The open volume claims Cahn is practicing eisegesis. He starts with the events of 9/11 and constructs a pattern backward, literally forcing the ancient text to fit modern American events, rather than discovering a pattern naturally within the text itself.
For a perfect example of this in action, just look at the botanical mismatch here. In Isaiah 9:10, the text specifically mentions Middle Eastern sycamores, which are basically fig trees, and cedars. But at ground zero, the tree that fell was an American sycamore. Guys, an American sycamore and a Middle Eastern ficus are completely different species. The review points out it's a bit like pointing to a house cat and claiming it fulfills a prophecy about a Bengal tiger. And the tree planted to replace it? A Norway spruce, not a cedar. The review points out that Cahn relies on some extreme semantic gymnastics here. He bends definitions to force a prophetic match just because the English translation happens to use the word sycamore.
The reviewer goes even further to show how this method actually conflicts with the foundational interpretive standards of pretty much every major Christian tradition. Reformed and Baptist traditions reject it because it violates the rule that Scripture interprets Scripture. Wesleyan Arminians value reason, and reason rejects the book's reliance on numerology. Catholic readers would note it operates entirely outside the constraints of the magisterium, and even Pentecostal and charismatic traditions, who might actually be the most open to modern prophecy, require a prophecy to be falsifiable, which this constructed after-the-fact pattern simply is not.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Part 4, Strengths and Deep Weaknesses.
Now, the open volume is a fair reviewer. They don't just tear the book apart. They weigh its genuine merits against its flaws to give us a complete picture. So, what are the strengths? Well, the critique acknowledges Cahn writes with a genuine pastoral urgency. He truly cares about the moral condition of the country. Plus, the book uncovers some absolutely fascinating historical facts. For instance, George Washington's inauguration in the first official act of the U.S. government took place at St. Paul's Chapel, which sits right on the edge of ground zero. That is a stunning historical link. And honestly, the fictional dialogue format makes a very complex topic incredibly accessible to the average reader. But, and this is a big but, these strengths are heavily counterbalanced by some devastating weaknesses identified by the reviewer. First, there's no limiting interpretive principle. If you can stretch definitions like we saw with the sycamore tree, you could practically make any text fit any tragic event in history. Second is the genre confusion. By labeling it fiction, Cahn basically dodges academic accountability. It's a situation where defenders say it's just a story, but the author simultaneously claims the prophetic revelations are entirely factual. The review finds this deeply misleading.
And then there's the massive weakness of the economic argument. The review takes a super harsh stance here, calling the Shemitah argument pure numerology, not economics. Sure, the 2001 and 2008 crashes fell on the 29th of Elul, but you know what? The Hebrew calendar has a 29th of Elul every single year. The reviewer points out that Cahn simply ignores the multitude of massive global financial crashes that don't fit his 7-year pattern. He cherry-picks the dates that match his conclusion and completely discards the rest.
Finally, Part 5, the final verdict.
So, after laying out the context, the methodology, the strengths, and the weaknesses, where do they ultimately land? Well, before the final stamp, the review cites a major intellectual failure. The book completely fails to engage with any standard biblical scholarship regarding the book of Isaiah. Furthermore, it completely ignores detailed book-length theological rebuttals published against it, like David James's The Harbinger, Fact or Fiction. Cahn just proceeds as if these academic guardrails and counterarguments don't even exist.
Because of this, the final verdict from the open volume is not recommended. And this quote really sums up why. The not recommended verdict reflects a genuine intellectual failure at the load-bearing center of the book's argument, not a disagreement with his pastoral aims. It's not that the reviewer dislikes Cahn's pastoral aims or his desire for a morally strong nation. The issue is that the foundational method used to build the book's entire premise is exegetically incoherent. It operates without any scholarly constraint.
And that leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to think about. When human beings read sacred texts and try to apply them to modern events, are we actually discovering a divine truth, or are we just creatively constructing patterns to make sense of a chaotic world? The open volume argues that the Harbinger is doing the latter. It's a fascinating look at how we interpret texts in history. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this structured dive has helped you grasp the core of this theological critique. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.